And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Welcome to the Republic for the United States of America. This is the Repuplic News Network live weekly national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. It's June the 16th, and tonight's RNN featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. The RNN, which stands for the Repuplic News Network, has been doing this radio show for about 6 years, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. It's in fact true. In law, the United States is a federal corporation, and their jurisdiction lies within the borders of the District of Columbia. You can find this information under Title 28, Section 3002 and UCC 9-307H. Say the Republic was just a bunch of U.S. citizens that realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders intended. We've been hard at work now for 8 years, and we've successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know it's hard to understand, but don't worry. All of us are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government. You can consider the Republic members are simply tired of all the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there's two forms of government here on our land, and we did something about it. We're people. We have mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too can be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and the Republic for the United States of America. Before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head with us in prayer. Father God, thank you for this opportunity to serve you, tell the truth. Lord, help this nation, help the people, help all the de facto corporate agencies that are working towards trying to support this Republic agency. There's people, Lord, out there that do want this Republic to be re-inhabited. So, Father God, just bless this call, bless the people on it, and this information on this call tonight is going to be amazing. We thank you, Lord, for the guests. We thank you, Lord, for Dan Happel and his heart to tell the truth, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, I yield the floor to Mr. Dan Happel.
Good afternoon. I really would love to introduce our next guest for the Connecting the Dots radio show, a very personal favorite of mine and someone that has been leading the charge against the so-called anthropogenic global warming, man-caused global warming fraud that has been part of the whole scientific debate over the last 10 or 15 years. And now we are finally getting to the point where a lot of this fraud is being exposed. And much of that is a result of our next guest here, Lord Christopher Monckton, who is a outspoken critic. He was Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's science advisor. He worked with the Independence Party in Scotland as a leader of that party, and he has been very outspoken and has attended a lot of the conferences around the world on Agenda 21 and then also on the IPCC and the global warming scam. And our other guest tonight is a good personal friend and someone that we've had on our show before, and that is Deborah Bacigalupi, Debbie, and she is a very strong advocate of the control of the West through private property. She's been fighting against the takeover of the West, a lot of the water projects and dams and so forth that are being dismantled under the so-called reclamation of the West under the rewilding of America. So we've got some really distinguished guests tonight, and I would like to start the conversation with a quote, by the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, lead author Dr. Ottmar Edenhofer. And in that quote, he says, "We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." That was in November 13th of 2010, that quote. And I also have another quote by Christiana Figueres. She is the executive director of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this was at Doha, Qatar in 2012. And this is, quote, "It must be understood that what is occurring here, not just in Doha, but in the whole climate change process, is a complete transformation of the economic structure of the world, a centralized transformation that is going to make the life of everyone on the planet very different," unquote. And with that, Lord Monckton, I would love to have you start this discussion this evening and this dialogue with a description, if you would, of the IPCC, its composition of real scientists versus the environmentalists and bureaucrats that drive the process, and much of the real science that has been perverted as a result of their substitution of policy for science.
Well, let's start with a wonderful book by Donna Laframboise, a journalist who investigated the IPCC. And she found that in the references, the scientific references that they quote, which are supposed to be to papers published by scientists after peer review in learned journals, she found that about a third of all the references in the documents by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC as it's called, were in fact party political broadcasts and handouts from communist organizations and handouts from environmentalist organizations. They were not scientific documents at all. And the IPCC is not a scientific body. It is an intergovernmental, it is a political body. It was founded by Sir Maurice Strong, a communist who spent his last years living in China. It is maintained by communists now, such as Christiana Figueres, who is the head of the negotiating process. And of course, Ottmar Edenhofer, another well-known communist. And all of these people have realized, well, they realized this when the Berlin Wall came down, that if they wanted to make communism once again acceptable in the West, they needed to find some way of getting the West to communize itself. And the environment was the excuse that they used. Now you may think, is that Monckton just another Reds under the beds right-wing fanatic? Well, no. Everything I've just said to you really comes from Dr. Patrick Moore, who was the head of Greenpeace, actually founded Greenpeace. And then when Greenpeace decided they were going to mount a campaign against chlorine, this was many years ago now, chlorine, as you may know, being one of the 130-odd elements that we know to exist. And here was Greenpeace decided to campaign against one of the elements that existed. He realized that Greenpeace that he had founded was no longer about science, it was about extreme left politics. And he wasn't an extreme leftist or rightist. He was an environmentalist, genuine, still is an environmentalist of a genuine kind. And what has happened is that these groups like Greenpeace, all of which one by one have been taken over by communists, the World Wide Fund for Nature is another one, there's about half a dozen of them, the Natural Resources Defense Fund, all of these big organizations with multi-billion-dollar annual budgets. Some of these budgets are now bigger than small countries in Africa. They've got an awful lot of money to spend. And they are all now run by people who in the old days would have been honest enough to call themselves communists. But now that the word communist is hated, and even the word socialist is beginning to be tainted in the same way, they call themselves environmentalists. So green is the new red. And the IPCC listens with far greater respect to these communists than it does to real scientists. And that is why so few scientists are really involved in the IPCC process. And a lot of the claims they make that the IPCC is compiled by tens of thousands of scientists, it isn't in fact true. There's about a dozen of them at the core of the process. And the rest are all either transiently part of a small corner of it, or they find that papers like mine that are published in the scientific journals are picked up by the IPCC and quoted. And the IPCC then says that we are members of and supporters of the IPCC, which of course we're not. So this is a thoroughly dishonest organization, a very expensive one. When I arranged for a question to be put down in the House of Lords about how much money the British government had paid to support the IPCC since its foundation in 1988, I was told, it was an entirely false answer from the government, that there is no such information available, which indicates the government isn't keeping its accounts of how it spends taxpayers' money properly. The IPCC is thoroughly corrupt, and those who have dealings with it seem to be similarly very easily corrupted. And I was a contributor to the 2013 fifth assessment report of the IPCC. I was one of its expert reviewers, and I sent in 80 pages of review comments just on the summary for policymakers. I didn't bother to go any further because nobody else ever does. And this summary was an entirely political document. It made no sort of scientific sense. Everything was wildly exaggerated, and not a single one of the hundreds of comments I made with detailed references, one comment alone actually had 450 papers cited as references to justify the comments I was making. Not one of these comments made its way into the final draft of the report because they don't want anyone to upset what is a purely preconceived storyline that has no basis in reality. And indeed, I tested this once when in 2007 they published an entirely bogus graph trying to show that the rate of global warming is itself accelerating and that we are to blame. And this graph was based on a well-known statistical dodge, which if you applied it, say, to a sine wave, which has by definition a zero trend, you can make it look as though it's got a rising trend, even though it hasn't. You use multiple different trend lines, starting at different points and all ending at the same point. And that's what the IPCC did. And then they said because the more recently starting trend lines were steeper than the ones further back, therefore the rate of global warming was accelerating. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, as the example of the sine wave shows very clearly. But they did this deliberately, because when I wrote, in my capacity as an expert reviewer, and I said this won't do, they refused to correct it, but they were also entirely unable to justify it. So I went to see one of the dozen lead authors whose names were right at the front of the document at an international conference in Colombia. This was about 3 years ago. And I said to him, this is dishonest. And if you go on peddling this kind of dishonesty and refusing to correct it, then this is a very serious matter. And he was entirely unable to understand the difference between honesty and dishonesty, between right and wrong, between scientific truth and scientific falsehood. So completely eaten away was he by communism that he was no longer capable of distinguishing right from wrong, true from false, good from bad. This is how far this entire absence of morality, which is the characteristic of communism, has gone. I should say not just communism, it's totalitarianism generally, because a lot of these people are corporatists. They are engaging large corporations in this climate plot for the sake of making themselves very rich. And these corporations are also finding ways by increasing, for instance, electricity prices to make it look as though what they're doing is good for the planet. Well, all it is really is it's good for their bank balances. So the IPCC is a thoroughly disreputable organization, which has incidentally been reported to the Swiss police. It's headquartered in Switzerland, like so many dubious organizations, because the Swiss police, as long as they go on paying lots of money into Switzerland's coffers, the Swiss police are told just look the other way. And there's a ghastly organization called the Bureau de l'Escroquerie, escroquerie being the French word for fraud, which is supposed to look into organizations like the IPCC and examine whether or not it is a legitimate organization and whether or not it is in fact operating an enormous international fraud, what Professor Nicholas Merner, the world's greatest expert on sea level, has called the largest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind. And the Bureau d'Escroquerie will not even answer letters on this subject. They are playing the Switzerland's old game of protecting every crook around the world. And now we have crooks operating at governmental level in concert with the IPCC, peddling this climate story, but we now know that they got it wrong. I have recently issued what I call the global warming speedometer. And the global warming speedometer is rather like a real speedometer. It shows, first of all, the rates at which the IPCC had predicted in its 5 big assessment reports that the world would warm, and then it shows what has really happened. And what's really happened is that there has been a little warming, but it's right at or below the very bottom estimate that the IPCC had predicted. But government policy is being made all around the world on the basis that it's the top estimate that's right. And there's no basis for this anymore. We've now got, after all, a quarter of a century of temperature records since the IPCC's first bogus assessment report on the climate in 1990. And we know perfectly well from that the predictions they made were wildly exaggerated. To give you a few figures, because I should always put a few figures on this, they predicted that warming over the last 15 years should have been occurring at a rate equivalent to somewhere between 1.9 and 4.2 Celsius per century. Their best estimate was 2.8. But the actual amount is not 1.9 even. It's certainly not 4.2. It's nowhere between those high and low estimates. It's only 0.5 Celsius, according to the satellites, and about 1 to 1.5 Celsius per century, according to the land-based temperature records. And you may think, well, why are the land-based temperature records showing so much warming? This is the actual measurements now, showing so much more warming than the satellite-based one. The answer is, of course, the land-based records are now largely made up. They've been altered so many times to try to make the apparent rate of warming match the rate they predicted. But even though they've tried to do that, it still shows a rate of warming which is far below anything that the IPCC had predicted in 1990. And gradually, bit by bit, the IPCC has been compelled by me among others, to reduce its forecast. They're still far too high, but still temperature is not matching them. And the fact is, here you've got this dishonest organization reducing its forecast of how much warming we're going to get from man-made influence from each report to the next, and yet saying that the problem is getting worse. Well, that plainly isn't right. And so what we've been trying to do, there's a small group of scientists to which I belong, we've been trying to put out scientific papers that give the balancing figures, that show what's actually happening, and that also look at why it was that these huge exaggerations in the rate of global warming had been cooked up. How did they do it? How did they fiddle their computer models to show this? And I published a paper last January in 2015 in the Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is the largest Academy of Sciences in the world. And that paper had taken months to prepare. There were 4 of us who wrote it. And we came to the conclusion at the end of that yes, you're going to get some warming if you put carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, from which it came in the first place. But it won't be very much. And that paper was then viciously attacked, of course, by the communists worldwide. Very few scientists were willing to attack it because we had done our equations very carefully and we had found where they'd got it wrong in their wretched computer models, and we'd explained it all very carefully and very clearly and with lots of sums that you could follow if you were a scientist to see what we were saying. And people in China now are beginning to realize, therefore, that this story has been oversold. And because of the various attacks that were made on this in public by various, again, mostly extreme left sources, the paper achieved an enormous publicity, an enormous fame, and it's now, I think by a factor of 12, the most widely downloaded of the papers that have been published in the 60-year archive of that distinguished journal of the world's largest Academy of Sciences. So gradually, bit by bit, we are forcing the world's scientists to face the truth that they have allowed science to be captured by politicians whose motivation is profoundly anti-Western, anti-capitalist, and anti the human race. This is a very important thing. The policy of environmentalists is to kill off humanity, if possible, altogether. And they're trying very hard. You see books like that of Paul Ehrlich, who is an advisor inevitably to Mr. Obama, who said a few years, 30 years ago now, that by now the world's population would have increased so much that we would all be dying. Well, it hasn't happened. Every single one of the extreme predictions made by everybody from Ehrlich to the IPCC has proven to be wildly overdone. And gradually it is becoming impossible, even for the communists, to go on trotting out this nonsense with a straight face. Yes, you've still got people like Mr. Obama, and you've still got a few nincompoops like David Cameron here in the United Kingdom, or Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, and that fellow Trudeau in Canada, who have stupid views on this. Because why do they have these views? Not because they believe that global warming is a problem, but because they believe the only people to whom the issue of global warming matters are the communists, who will scream blue murder unless you say you think it's a problem. Whereas those of us who are on the scientific side of the debate and therefore don't shriek in the same way that the communists do, they're not so frightened of us. So they do what the communists want them to do, because the communists, or environmentalists as they now call themselves, shout louder. Well, those days are now over. We are now beginning to make much more noise than we did. We're beginning to make much more traction within the scientific community than we did. And scientists are beginning to recover the courage to hear the other side of the case. I went to the mathematics department at my own alma mater, Cambridge University, just a few weeks ago to give a blackboard seminar on the equations that govern climate sensitivity and radiative transfer, so that one could see where the errors in the official model's equations were. And I gave that seminar to two of the world's most powerful and expert mathematical logicians. And the top man at the end of it, he said, you know, that was extremely interesting. They had no idea what had been going on when they saw the equations, and they saw what these people had done to those equations, how they tortured them to get the answers they wanted out of them. They both said it was entirely clear that you could not base what they have based, this extreme nonsense, on these equations. And they said they really couldn't believe that these were the equations that they used. So I said, well, you can go to Chapter 6 of the third assessment report, Chapter 6.1, and you'll see the elementary equations there, and I can show you where the development of those equations occur in the subsequent reports. I can show you every stage of it. I can show you exactly what they've done, how they've done it, who they bribed so as to get away with doing it. And this nonsense is gradually being taken apart, because I'm now in charge of an outfit called the Fraud Investigation Team of the International Committee on Geoethics, which is trying to bring some sort of basic morality back into the sciences. And we are now investigating not the whole climate story, but a few very specific, very fraudulent scientists who have deliberately made up results and bent the equations in a manner which we can demonstrate was deliberately false. This is a very unusual thing to be able to do. Normally, people can say, oh, well, they just got it wrong, or they were just going along with the crowd. What we are going after is those few who have deliberately, cynically manipulated the truth for their own profit and at the expense of the general taxpayer. And that, in UK law and in US law, is the serious felony of fraud. And we are going after these people. We've already reported some to the police in 3 continents. They don't want to investigate because they are frightened of their own government. So the police themselves have become, to some extent, corrupted by this. They don't really want to look at frauds in the scientific sphere, partly because they think it's difficult, which it isn't always difficult, and partly because they think it's not a good career move. So our next step will be to go in front of the courts in those jurisdictions, such as England, where it is possible for a private citizen to mount his own prosecution when the police have refused to investigate. And so that's what we're going to do. And we're going to expose the corruption not only of the scientists who have been producing bogus science here in the UK, not of all of them, just one or two, but we're also going to expose the laziness of the police in not having been willing to investigate what are, on any view, plainly frauds. So we're going after the fraudsters as well. And I think it'll only take a couple of prosecutions, and the rest of the scientific community will run for cover. They'll realize it's no longer wise to provide a cover behind which the fraudsters can lurk. Science is going to have to stand up for itself again. Otherwise, a lot of scientists are going to find themselves in jail alongside the fraudsters because they have allowed the fraudsters to operate, provided them cover at universities, and therefore have made themselves into accessories after the fact of the original fraud. And we've been talking to legal experts, again on 3 continents, to make sure that we can produce the legal arguments to back up the factual arguments, which in the 2 or 3 cases which we think are worth pursuing, are really good cases which we'd win on the facts. We're now also confident we can win on the law and leave the courts with the impression that they should hear these cases, and then it'll be a matter for a jury to decide whether or not a fraud has been committed. And what we have done is to do some sort of jury focus groups, and we've presented to them some of the testimony that we've gathered, and they have been horrified at what they've seen. And we've said to them, you're only hearing one side of the story. There is another side to the story, and that you would also hear if this went to court. So you mustn't assume that everything we're telling you is true. We think it is, but the other side are entitled to their defense too. But I'm pretty sure from the reaction we've had from our jurors, as it were, as a test bed, that they would convict. And I think we are going to be starting to send some of these bogus scientists and some of these bogus PR agents for the scientists and some of these universities to prison. And of course you can't send a whole university to prison, but you can lock up its vice-chancellor and you can fine it very, very, very large amounts of money, and you can take away its grants. And we think that this is going to have to be done in just 1 or 2 cases so that other universities will wake up and realize that running a fraud because it's profitable is a crime even if it's committed in the groves of academia, just as much as it would be in the City of London or on the manufacturing shop or in the retail unit. Wherever you commit a fraud, then we will come after you and we will put you in prison. We only have to do 2 or 3 of those, and everybody else will run for cover, and this scare will vanish in the night, almost overnight. And all these elaborate structures like the IPCC will be hacked away and defunded, which is the only correct thing to do with the IPCC. And this leads me neatly back to your original question. Does the IPCC have any future? The answer is no. Its future is firmly, permanently in the past.
Well, Lord Monckton, one of the things that I always thought was a basic premise of real science was that you constantly challenged accepted hypotheses and explored the inconsistencies in those hypotheses, just so that you could prove that the science was good. And now under this new system, they basically say, well, the debate is over, and yet they claim to be real scientists. And I think your explanation here and your exposure of these inconsistencies show that the science is really not science anymore. It's political science. It's policy. And I think that kind of reminds me of Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. And I think of the real scientists that were sold out to the political power and coercion of the socialists in control of the system. Debbie, I'd like you to kind of weigh in on what your experiences were at the COP21 conference over in Paris. And incidentally, Lord Monckton, I found out that you were a concert pianist as a result of a video that Debbie did of your piano concerto. So, Debbie, would you like to talk about what happened in Paris?
Mr. Happel, I'd just like to do a quick station identifier break for the Republic News Network prior to moving forward with Debbie. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming on our radio shows every week, week in and week out for the last 6 years. The Republic News Network, you can find us at republicfortheunitedstates.org. We host a series of phone calls and radio shows and podcasts and broadcasts on that website for the last 6 years, explaining what we have done, how we've done it, and how we came about. Again, this was a transition from 2010, but the most important call, I believe, for the week, outside of the prayer calls on Monday, are the Wednesday evening Building the States phone call. That phone call is where you would bring your family and friends and people that are interested in not just sitting back and watching somebody else do what it takes to make this happen, meaning fully re-inhabit this de jure republic nation, but people that are interested in building their states, state by state, county by county. So the Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. Pacific call is a very important call for people to sit back, listen to, understand, digest, and start stepping out of their comfort zone and becoming a part of this republic. Again, republicfortheunitedstates.org. Again, I apologize for the interruption, and Debbie, I'm going to yield the floor to you. Thank you.
Sure, and yes, he is Lord Monckton is a marvelous pianist. He is, Lord Monckton, you are so talented in so many areas, and I would love to tell you.
That. It's lovely to hear. Tell everybody.
He is fabulous. In fact, as I go around the country and speak about United Nations Agenda 21, I can, and for people who are listening newly and just discovering Agenda 21, I stumbled upon it, and the very first video that I ever saw was Lord Monckton, and I was hooked. And I remember late at night, it was early in the morning, because I had been doing all research on as a cattle rancher and hearing these different things that were going on in our property and the property around us. I had to connect the dots, and I stumbled upon one of Lord Monckton's many videos, and I was mesmerized about what I was hearing and what I was seeing him talk about. And I said, as soon as I went through several videos, I saw one, and then I saw two, and then I saw three, and kept looking for more and more videos, and then I found Michael Shaw, and then I found a woman named Dr. Rima who in an old video talking about Codex Alimentarius and United Nations food law, and I connected the dots. And Lord Monckton is my hero. He is the first one who really exposed Agenda 21 to me, connected the dots, and then I had the distinct honor of meeting him in San Diego. Lord Monckton came to California. I'm a Californian, and we have cap and trade here in California. And Lord Monckton was doing, not only did he go to Sacramento to try and battle the state government from implementing AB 32 and SB 375, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and cap and trade, but he spoke in different places throughout California to educate the public on what we were being forced into and how it was going to cost California taxpayers just billions, if not trillions, right? Trillions of dollars by the time this whole cap and trade scheme is said and done. And then in 2012, I had the honor of joining Lord Monckton at the United Nations Rio Earth Summit with Craig Rucker of of CFACT and Climate Hustle and Mark Morano, which leads us into Paris. One of the main reasons I went to Paris is I wanted to see, and just for history's sake, the Climate Hustle, which you can go to climatehustle.org to see many things that Lord Monckton are talking about, exposing how the United Nations is full of fraud, Al Gore full of fraud, all based on what Lord Monckton discussed, which is just taking snippets of models and then saying those snippets of models within snippets of time are, fact on climate change and global warming, when really all we are being is propagandized and scammed at the ultimate level. And if you look at the people who are pushing this agenda, not only are they crooks and hypocrites, but they're making, tons and tons of money, while we humans, the average human being is being forced to limit our lifestyle. They call it limits to growth or earth overshoot, saying that we are over-consuming and we are planetary villains. In fact, children's books even talk about how adults are planetary villains who are, just using the land for their own benefit, or farmers are using the land for, to ranchers like my family are using our land, our private property, to raise cattle. And cattle in the 21st century are also planetary villains. Why? Because they fart and they burp and they emit methane, and supposedly methane is just one of the greenhouse gases that's destroying planet Earth. I'm going to add in something. Yeah,
yes,
Lord Monckton.
The amount of methane in the atmosphere has barely risen in the last 10 or 15 years. It was rising before, and the reason why it was rising was that the communist Siberian pipeline, by which gas was transferred from the fields in Siberia to be overcharged for in Europe, where we burn it here, was so leaky that it was putting methane straight out into the atmosphere all along its 1,200, in fact, its 3,000-mile length. That was why the methane concentration was rising. And cattle make virtually no difference to the amount of methane in the atmosphere, which is why it's completely, you don't need, in the words of that lovely man, Congressman Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, there's no need for a cow fart tax. It's completely unnecessary, because the biggest biogenic source of methane in the world is not cows anyway, it's termite ants. And have you heard the Greens campaign to get rid of termite ants? No, of course not, because capitalist farmers don't rear termite ants, they try to destroy them. So the communists are not interested in doing anything about the termite ants. That would make a far bigger difference to global warming than doing away even with all the cattle in the world. So the methane story is a complete distraction, and all one has to do, and it shows the dimness of our journalistic class these days, is to look up the increase in the concentration of methane over the last 15 years. It has barely risen. It's risen by so small an amount, it's equivalent to approximately 50 parts per million of CO2 extra in the atmosphere, compared with the 400 that's already there. And that would raise temperatures by so small an amount over 100 years that you couldn't even measure it. So you can forget about a cow fart tax. There's no need to worry about methane. It is not a problem.
Well, at this stage, I'd like to maybe have you, Lord Monckton, discuss the extensive evidence that the carbon credit system that Debbie just talked about is going to be used as the new world currency when the financial system collapses, and maybe explain how these so-called mad scientists have captured the idea of carbon sequestration and carbon dioxide as a bad gas or a bad thing, when in fact it's actually a good thing, and how they are planning on using that as a way to create a new financial system.
Well, let's be very clear, first of all, that carbon dioxide is absolutely essential to all life on Earth. And I recently jointly authored a paper with Patrick Moore, the founder of Greenpeace, on this very subject. And he had done a lot of research going back into the paleoclimate, the early climate. And we can go back quite a long way by various methods using ice cores and so forth. And he had worked out that over the last few 100,000 years, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the long term is declining and declining and declining. And in another couple of million years, he reckons that if we don't put more of it back into the atmosphere, then there won't be enough to keep plants going. Already when you get ice ages, there's only around 180 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If that were to fall just by another 30 parts per million to 150, all plant life on Earth would die just like that. At the moment, we're at 400 parts per million. All the plants and trees are breathing easier. Anyone who has a garden will know, if they've lived as long as I have, how much faster and more luxuriantly everything now grows because it's no longer being starved of carbon dioxide. My kind host here is looking out on his own garden and nodding and saying, yes, he has noticed that. This is now very good for plants. I find it extraordinary that people who call themselves green are trying to say that carbon dioxide is dangerous. But now let's get on to your financial aspect of the question, which is a particularly interesting aspect. Yes, there are climate extremists who are trying to say, let us turn carbon dioxide credits, as they're called, into a new currency. However, every time they have tried this, they have no understanding of how financial markets work. They have failed and failed abjectly and spectacularly. The Chicago Climate Exchange, into which Al Gore poured money, collapsed ignominiously only a few years after it was started. The European carbon credit system is riddled with fraud from top to bottom, like everything else to do with the EU, which I can announce proudly we are about to leave. We've got another few days to go, and then we vote, and we are voting to get out of the European Union, because that too is another of these communist takeover plots, and we're going to tell the governing class here and elsewhere around the world that we, the people, are fed up with that. They tried to run a so-called carbon credit scheme, and the price of the units in that scheme absolutely plummeted. And if that price was used as a currency, then you'd be looking at something like 1,000% inflation. It would really be a very, very bad currency indeed. So no, the way to deal with currencies as the fiat currencies of governments collapse all around the world is to adopt an idea that was put forward by that great Austrian economist Friedrich August von Hayek, whom I had the pleasure to meet at the Institute of Economic Affairs here in London 40 years ago now. And I asked him in particular about his theory of private currencies, and he gave a very good answer about it. He said, in the end, all fiat currencies, those are currencies that are just printed with no assets to back them, are doomed. He said they will all fail one by one. They will do much damage on the way to failing through inflation and through various other forms of corruption at government level. But in the end, he said, they will all fail. And at that point, the only hope is for competing private currencies, each of which has one characteristic which is inherited from the last such properly run private currency, which was the Mark Banker, the Bank of Hamburg, which operated for 250 years in Hamburg and provided absolute monetary stability, not only in Hamburg, but right across Europe, down as far as Venice, because they kept silver in the vaults equal to the value of all the notes in issue. And everybody knew that that's what they did, and everybody knew that a piece of paper from the Bank of Hamburg, denominated in Marx Banco, was as good as owning the silver in the vaults, because they always ran a completely honest book. And that's what we're going to have to do. And in fact, I'm already working now with programmers and others to set up a new private currency. Of course, we can't call it a currency, not in the UK. The government wants to have total control of the currency. But what we can call it is a fungible instrument of saving, which will have real assets to back every single electronic unit that we issue. And you'll be able to have, in effect, a savings account from which you can draw out and pay in every day with your credit card. And so this just goes beyond currency. You don't need currency if you do this. Your savings are your currency, and your savings are held in the talent bank. And this is the way forward for currency. No more printing and minting. You just use cards to do it. And it provides such a good rate of return that had you had $1 in talent in 1913, when the US Fed was founded, that would be $5,000 now. But if you had had $1 in the Fed in 1919, you would have 1 cent now, because of the loss through inflation that the Fed has caused with its fiat or printed currency. So that's the way to deal with currencies, not to make the currency even more bogus by adopting these ludicrous carbon credits. You can see when people come forward with ideas quite as bad as that these are people who are intending to destroy capitalism. That is their first and foremost purpose. They are not wishing to set up a good currency. They're trying to destroy founder currencies with more bogus ones, because that's a really quick way of completely undermining capitalism. What is astonishing is how many bankers and politicians who really ought to know better are falling for this nonsense. But I am proud to have known one who died only 3 days ago, Lord Leach, my noble friend, Lord Leach of Fairford, and he was in Parliament the man who knew more about the climate than anyone else. And if he had a question about some obscure corner of the mathematics of the equation, he would get in touch from his office at the huge merchant bank, where he'd been the eminence grise for 30 years, and he would say, can you explain this and can you explain that? And then he would go and brief the board on it. They pulled out of all this climate garbage because he showed them what nonsense it was. And he is now merry in heaven. But what a great man he was. We need more politicians like him who are willing to do the homework and really try to understand the ins and outs of the mathematics. Of course, no politician can do this on every subject. But given the amount of time they spend banging on no knowledge whatsoever about climate change, you'd think that a few more of them would have the guts to emulate Rodney Leach and do the homework and really find out what is the truth about the climate. But certainly one thing we do not want is any kind of currency based on carbon credits. That is a doomed idea, and it will go no further.
Oh, I agree. I think that is probably the one single thing that will alarm the American people enough to get at least a little bit of resistance back. And Debbie, you are probably really familiar with this, but we have right now a group of governors and liberal governors, and also various legislators from states around the country that are pushing forward the idea of fining or imprisoning anyone that challenges the global climate change hysteria. And I am really pleased to hear, Lord Monckton, that you are doing something that will put an end to that kind of craziness, because that's the exact opposite of what our system of government was intended to do, and that is...
We are investigating, too, of the people who are doing this scam by which they say they're going to arrest climate skeptics just because they're skeptical. You see, there's no suggestion by these people that they're going to go after people who are committing fraud. They're not saying we're committing fraud. They're just saying we're not towing the party line, and that ought to be a criminal offense. Well, that's not acceptable to us, and we've discovered that the man who is largely behind this business of trying to prosecute climate skeptics is himself taking millions every year from this climate scam in ways which are highly dubious, and he is now being investigated. So these people are not going to get away with this any longer. They've had a free ride because the press has been so dismally unwilling to ask any of the right questions. But some of the press are beginning to wake up and realize they can't go on being as dim as they've been until now. So I think we will soon put the scamsters to bed who are trying to say that merely because you're a climate skeptic you ought to be in prison.
Oh, that's wonderful. That really is. Debbie, do you see changes in California in that kind of a, I guess I'd call it a mind think or one-mindedness to follow the phony global warming thing?
Absolutely. Interesting that you ask. In Facebook today, I saw an article about, it's called Secrecy Lobby Runs Amok at State Capitol. And it's the American Spectator. It's an article in the American Spectator. And here's the line. The California Climate Science Truth and Accountability Act, it was an act that was tried to push through or voted on in this primary in June, was shelved, but offered insight into the totalitarian mindset that's taking hold among leaders of the nation's most populous state, in other words, California. Which state is the only state that has a cap-and-trade scheme? California. Which state right now is implementing the possibility of the largest dam removal project in worldwide history? California, which is up near my parents' ranch. This article goes on to say that Measure SB 1161 cannot be written off as an aberration. Consider AB 2880, another bill that would let the state government sue political activists, ordinary citizens, and the media for publicizing information officials would rather keep under wraps. So just like in California, just like California always does, if it doesn't get something passed the first time, it's going to try until it gets passed eventually. And, you know, you asked me earlier about what happened in Paris. One of the most extraordinary things that I saw was with Lord Monckton, Patrick Moore, CFACT, Climate Depot, you know, amazing scientist Fred Singer, who must be in his 90s, who flew to Paris to be there for a day that was put on by Lord Monckton and other, you know, scientists that the United Nations loves to hate data. And what occurred, so this event, out of all the thousands of events that happened at COP21, at the main, where the United Nations hosted this big, you know, COP21 international conference that had like 50,000 people trying to determine by how many degrees we are going to capture the world's temperature and how we're going to do that. How are we going to do that? We are all going to limit our lifestyles. We're going to live a sustainable, we're going to be foot soldiers for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. For example, by the year 2020, have the number of traffic accidents worldwide. How do you do that? There's only one way you can do that, is limit the number of drivers that are out there. By the year 2020, they want all water. These are, by the way, the 2030 agenda that the White House, you can look up White House fact sheet. The 2030 agenda has, in less than 4 years, by the year 2020, to control all water-related ecosystems, lakes, forests, oceans, everything. So they want the United Nations Environment Program in control of absolutely every water-related ecosystem. We see farmers now in various areas, in Oregon, for example, for possibly being sued for collecting the water, the rainwater that falls off his roof. What I saw in Paris, which was extraordinary, out of all these events that were going on, CFACT and Lord Monckton had one day to say, we need to examine the data. Come on, let's debate this. You're going to fundamentally transform every human life on planet Earth from here till eternity. And we just want to debate with you guys. Well, not only was Lord Monckton snubbed and ignored, but they sent protesters over. And the protesters were, you know, just nowhere at the United Nations conference were there protesters, but at Lord Monckton's event. And you know what? We just want an opportunity to say, let's look at the data. Let's look at the data. But, Dan, to answer your question, yes, we are being told now in the United States the science is settled. Obama says the science is settled. We are living in a technocracy now because technocracy is all about scientific dictatorship. And you will go along. And if you don't go along, you will be punished.
Anyone who says the science is settled is not speaking the truth. The science is very seldom settled. In mathematics, we have certainties. For instance, in both the Euclidean and in the hyperbolic plane, if you take a right-angled triangle, then the square on the hypotenuse will equal the sum of the squares on the catheti. That much is demonstrable, we can prove it, and that is settled mathematics. But science, which depends on measurement and observation and verification and checking and checking and checking again, there is no certainty in science. The founder of the scientific method in the East, as Thales of Miletus had founded it in the West, was Ibu Ali ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Haytham. He was as proud of his ancestry as I of mine. And he said the seeker after truth, and that was his beautiful term for the scientist, the seeker after truth doesn't start by saying the science is settled. He doesn't start by accepting a consensus, however venerable or however widespread. On the contrary, he subjects it to what he has learnt of science. And he subjects it to scrutiny and verification, investigation, inquiry, inspection, checking, and checking again. The road to the truth, he said, is long and hard, but that is the road we must follow. And so anybody who comes along and says, oh, well, you know, these are old scientists, they're all a long way ago, we know better now, the Communist Party tells us what is right science. We've had that before. We had it with Hitler and eugenics, and look how many tens of millions died as a result of that. Then we had the communists. Look how many tens of hundreds of millions died of that. When you start hearing people say the science is settled, then you are hearing totalitarians who are preparing to kill millions all over again. That's why this matters. If you just take the winter of 2011 to 12 here in the United Kingdom, where for the entire month of December, over the entire landmass of the United Kingdom, for the first time since satellite measurements began, there was snow on the ground everywhere, and the temperatures were below zero day and night for a whole month. 7,000 additional people died in that 1 month, not so much because the weather was cold, but because their homes were cold, because they could no longer afford to heat them, because of the savage increases in electricity prices that have been made by our stupid governing class to subsidize useless wind farms which delivered precisely 1% of the total capacity they were supposed to produce in that month, and a tiny fraction of 1% of all electricity because there was virtually no wind during the entire month. And we have to subsidize these nonsensical medieval technologies to try and solve 21st century non-problems. And frankly, it is time that we said to our governing class, grow up, as we're saying to the governing class here in Europe, where we're now about to leave the European Union. We're going to say, we the people will no longer tolerate this anti-scientific nonsense. And the answer to what California is doing, the answer to what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is doing, the answer to what various bankers and politicians and trade unionists and church leaders and other comfortable figures of the establishment are doing, is to do what in democracies we can always do, to vote them out. That's what we're going to do with the European Union. We're going to get rid of it. Before long, if you want my guess, there will be a movement in Britain and in many other countries to vote ourselves out of the United Nations. It once had a noble purpose. It has no noble purpose any longer. It is time for it to go. And if it won't go, it's time for us to go. And I think we've got to start withdrawing from any international or supranational or global organization whose governing body is not elected by all of us. And the significant thing about every supranational or global organization that exists around the world is that not a single one of them is elected by the peoples of the states parties to the treaties governing those entities. And it's time that we realize that a transfer of power from the national to the international or global level is a transfer of power away from democracy and back into the hands of the dictators. Look at the mess they made in the 20th century. Are we really going to allow them to make a similar mess and kill as many hundreds of millions again in the 21st? I hope not.
Well, I agree, and I think that one of the questions that I was going to pose to you as we get toward the end of this radio program is to ask you about the Brexit and how the British feel about getting out of the European Union, because obviously right now that's creating a lot of panic.
It's creating a panic among the governing class, not among anybody else.
Right.
The people are very happy. And I think what is happening is that the campaign that has been run by those in the governing class who want to stay in the European Union because they make money out of it at the expense of the rest of it, they are very upset because what we have done is to explain that the European Union is not only non-democratic, it's anti-democratic. The way a law is made in the European Union was not until recently understood by virtually anybody in Britain. I knew, and I had written articles about it and broadcast about it, but most people didn't know. And it starts behind closed doors with people who are revealingly called by the Germans commissars. They're not elected by anybody. There are 28 of them, and they meet behind closed doors. Only they have the right to propose and to decide legislation in the European Union. Yes, there is an outfit called the Council of Ministers that does the detailed drafting, but there are no ministers on the Council of Ministers. That's another lot of bureaucrats answerable to the commissars. Then there is the so-called European so-called Parliament, which is neither European nor a parliament. It is just a talking shop. It has no power to propose a bill or bring forward legislation. It has no power to decide legislation. If the commissars decide that they don't like any decision taken by the European Parliament, they have the right under the Treaty of Maastricht simply to override the decision of the elected European Parliament. And if they don't want to bother even proposing legislation and sending it to allow the European Parliament to have a look at it, let alone decide it, then they can simply issue a thing called a Commission regulation. And that Commission regulation has the immediate force of supreme law throughout all the countries of the European Union, regardless of what the European or any national parliament has to say about it. Now, people are gradually finding out that this is the case, but it gets worse. Supposing you're in the Eurozone, which, thank heavens, thanks to me and others, we're not. We managed to fight against that and keep ourselves out of it. But the Eurozone has a thing called the Stability Pact, the European Stability Pact. And the treaty governing that pact allows the governing body of that treaty, that's a group of invisible establishment bankers, whom, again, nobody elects. We aren't even allowed to know who they are. They meet entirely off the public radar. They can, at any time under this treaty, demand that any amount of money be transferred from the national treasury of any country in the Eurozone into their coffers. And if there is any resistance on the part of those countries, they simply have the money confiscated. And what is more, if the people who control this hideous entity, the Stability Pact, act corruptly and put this money in their pockets and run off with it, they are totally immune under the treaty from any prosecution or any civil suit. They can come and raid your bank account and mine. Well, they can't raid them in the UK because we haven't joined. But they can raid in France and Germany and the other countries that are in the Euro. They can raid the bank accounts of anyone they like, and they can spend the money on holidays or blowing it on in the casino at Monte Carlo, buying themselves yachts, and there is absolutely no civil or criminal action that anyone anywhere in the world has the right to do to stop them. And this is why, now that these things are beginning to be found out here in the United Kingdom, because at last the press and even the unspeakable BBC are beginning to have a debate on this, where they've kept all this swept under the carpet until now. People are beginning to realize just how poisonously totalitarian the European Union has become, with these absolute powers of raiding anyone's bank account, now transferred into the hands of people whose existence we barely realize, and who are themselves totally immune from any form of prosecution or civil suit. That is the formal mechanism for dictatorship. It is a more or less exact mirror of the way the Soviet constitution treated the public and private finances. And that is what now the Eurozone has. It is no surprise that Britain is no longer the only country that wants to get out of the European Union. Poland, the Czech Republic, the whole of the southern half of France, the whole of Denmark, Sweden, all these countries are beginning to realize they will be far better off out. And so if you want my guess, I think we have now reached the crossover point. I think it now looks as though we have a real chance of getting about a 47 to 43% vote in favor of getting out of the European Union. And once that has happened, of course, the politicians will try to cheat, they'll try to lie, they'll try to find ways of keeping us imprisoned in this hideous dictatorship. But we will leave. Any politician who stands in our way, once the people have spoken, will himself be swept from office as we leave the European Union and we dump those politicians who had imprisoned us in this viciously expensive and arrogant system for so long.
Well, that is really a good segue into our final few minutes of the program. And Debbie, I would like to give you an opportunity, and then you, Lord Monckton, to give a little information on the work that you're involved in, and some of your websites, and some of the things that you would like the listening audience to pay particular attention to. So with that, Debbie, would you like to do kind of a quick wrap-up?
No sign of Debbie.
Hi, Debbie, are you still there?
She is
Yes,
there.
I am.
There you
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I just wanted you to do a kind of a quick wrap-up of
Okay.
some of the sites and so forth.
Yeah, okay. And, so some of the sites, technocracy.news, we are in a scientific dictatorship, and you can find out how we are being moved into technocracy and a new international or a new economic international order, an NEIO, sorry. And something that I want listeners to know is that, something that's very unique about the United States and worth fighting for, that even Lord Monckton has been, to the United States to help expose what's going on is our individual freedom and our form of government being representative and a constitutional republic, because we understand that in democracies around the world, that it is mob rule that leads to consensus that eventually leads to an oligarchy. And that's why our founding fathers were very clear about not calling us a democracy, but that we would have a democratic form of government that was to be, representative. Climate change is not representative, as you've heard Lord Monckton, and now these, regulations that are trying to criminalize people who question their science, and it's not even science, as you've heard. So anyway, to go back to some websites, technocracy.news, and also we are planning, and Lord Monckton's going to be there, Dan Happel's going to be there, I'm going to be there, there's going to be some extraordinary speakers, November 11th through 13th, most likely Las Vegas, and it's called the Red Pill Expo, because something's wrong. So please look for that. Go to Red Pill Expo or Freedom Force International to find out more about it. We have other scientists like Dr. Istvan Marco from Belgium who's coming out, Dr. Willie Soon, who are good friends with Lord Monckton, and Dr. Willie Soon is an astrophysicist exposing solar radiation and solar rares and how that impacts the climate, but you don't hear about that from the United Nations. So anyway, it'll be a fabulous conference, and I hope that everyone will pay attention to it. If you can't be there live, you'll web stream in and help us get the truth out about this hoax called global warming climate change.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. And Lord Monckton, before I'll give you the last few minutes here, but before you leave, I want you to know that we will work with you to arrange a conference in Montana, because we really would love to have you up here. And I know that one of the Nobel Prize winners, along with Al Gore, is a gentleman by the name of Professor Steve Running, and I would love to see he and you have a debate on the efficacy of man-made global warming. So with that said, would you please tell everyone the information on the sites that you have, and we'll look forward to having you on again at another time.
Fantastic. First of all, if Professor Running is listening, then I challenge him to that debate. I suspect, however, you will find him much more reluctant than I am to debate this issue. There are very few so-called climate, so-called scientists who are willing to debate with any of us who are skeptical on this issue, because they know we know too much. We know where the bodies are buried. So bring it on, Professor Running. I'm very happy to do that. And, of course, I would love to do that in the wonderful state of Montana. What a beautiful place it is. I've seen it on the web. I've seen films about it. I've always wanted to visit it, and this, Dan, will give me the ideal chance to do so. To read up on the climate, whatsupwiththat.com. That's WATTS, up with that, all in one word, .com. It's the most heavily visited climate science site in the world, and it is entirely a skeptical site, but it's also a very balanced one. Anthony Watts, who runs it, he's a lovely man. He's a meteorologist. He knows his stuff, and he runs a fair, balanced, and sensible skeptical website, which is also always brimming with up-to-the-minute news on the climate. I contribute usually a couple of times a month. It's a wonderful website. I would go to that for the climate. As for Brexit, you should go to ukip.org. That's ukip.org. That's the political party that was founded by an academic called Alan Sked, but has really taken prominence since Nigel Farage took it over as leader. He has been a sensational leader of the party. It's he and he alone who can claim credit for having won us our referendum. And even if, in the end, the people cannot find the courage to recover their freedom, at least we can all thank him for having led the way in making sure that at least we got the chance to have our say, a chance which is becoming rarer and rarer as democracy passes into the twilight and the shadow of dictatorship rises up again. But in Las Vegas from the 11th to the 13th of November, and eventually in Montana, those few of us who still believe that we were born to be free will be there to keep the torch of freedom burning, to hold it up as the Statue of Liberty holds it up. And we shall say, as I say to you now, God bless you, God bless America, and let freedom ring.
Well, thank you, Lord Monckton, and thank you, Debbie. This has been a fantastic program. I invite our guests, our listeners, to please tune in next week for another episode of Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. We will have a terrific program next week as well, and I thank you all for tuning in for this week's show. And with that, Kelby, I turn the program over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to conclude this week's broadcast for the Repuplic News Network. Since we went a little bit long, we're not going to be playing any closing music. We will see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. God bless and good night.